Hi everyone and welcome back to Low Carbon Higher Power. Today we're at Patton Church in Swindon and I'm really excited to be joined by sustainability expert and director of Inspired Efficiency, Matt Fulford.
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Yeah, good.
So, how's things? Is it busy time of the year for you?
Yeah, I think every time of the year is busy these days. A huge amount of demand out there for advice on all sorts of organisations using less energy, getting to net zero. I think every day's a busy day at the moment.
So for our audience members who may not know, I know quite a number of people I know have heard of Inspired Efficiency before, but for those who don't know Matt Fulford, what does Matt actually do for a living?
Yeah, so I set up Inspired Efficiency 12 years ago, and we advise all sorts of organisations. We started off advising them how to reduce their energy consumption, so be more energy efficient, and over the years that's sort of migrated more towards actually how do we get to be net zero carbon. Obviously the two are incredibly linked. They're not exactly the same, there's an overlap between them. I would say that we advise organisations on how to reduce their energy and how they get to net zero carbon. And most of that is done either in the public sector, where we do a lot of work within schools, or within the heritage sector, where we do a huge amount of work within churches. Those tend to be the two areas we work in the most. We're going out there doing energy audits. I suppose that's what we traditionally have called them and are still called. People now call them heat decarbonisation plans or net zero plans, but essentially we're out there, boots on the ground, poking around a building, looking in the boiler rooms, trying to work out where the electricity is coming from, all those kind of bits and pieces, to go, actually, this is what you can do to be really efficient and not put any carbon into the atmosphere. That's what we're about.
And I think also, again, we were talking earlier about it's another main selling point of what you do, where you're offering efficiency solutions. You're actually saving people a lot of money as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always has been and still is the kind of one of the key motivations of people wanting to do this or feeling they ought to be doing it, or with energy crisis kind of having a real need to do it, is that financial piece out there. It's not the only motivation.
Of course.
And we're normally finding with most bits of advice, if you do everything, yes, you are going to get a cost saving. If you start breaking it down line by line, you're going to see that, perhaps changing a light bulb is going to get you a really high saving. Putting in a heat pump, maybe not, but actually you blend everything together, you will get a saving out there.
Yeah. Upon my research of looking at the life of Matt Fulford, and there's not much out there, I must say. LinkedIn's a good source, but there's a few places you've worked that I've found some stuff out. But in terms of your motivations for coming into this field, I picked up a really cool quote from you. I don't know if this is something that you've actually said or if it's something that they've just wrote in, but the quote I found was direct from Matt: "My huge passion in life is to reduce carbon emissions. That's the reason I get out of bed every morning." Do you still feel like that?
Yeah, that is pretty much what I said. I think that's an accurate quote. I'm happy for those words to be attributed towards me. That is what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's probably leads me into having a few arguments with a few people as well.
Yeah.
Which I kind of think, well, someone's got to stand up for that, so why not me? But yeah, it is. I think I'm also on record as turning around and saying, actually, the thing I hate the most is waste. And not necessarily in terms of, cardboard or plastic. I do hate waste in those areas as well. But anything that's kind of inefficient is wasteful. It irks me. Yeah. Really, to my core, irks me. I'm like, why are you doing it like that? That's crazy. Yeah. And wasting precious resource and emitting carbon and everything else. Yeah, that is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Yeah. That's what makes... I couldn't work as hard as I do if I didn't really enjoy it. And the really enjoyable times are when you're coming into places going, as I did this morning, actually coming here. I walked in having done an energy audit of this about a year ago, this church we're in today. And they turned around and said, "Oh yeah, we followed your advice. We now don't use gas anymore." And I skipped several spaces down the corridor. Going, that's brilliant. And sometimes it's with regret you don't kind of hear back
Yes.
those stories enough. So that's made me very happy.
I mean, that's got to be so fulfilling, right? That upon your advice, you have, I mean, practically made a building net zero.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of net zero, as you will know, as you've done a lot of work on it over the years, so Church of England's net zero target of 2030 is what we're all working towards. I guess very broad question. Do you think it's achievable?
Now, that's a question I am asked quite a few times.
Me too.
Possibly in slightly less kind ways sometimes. Or the perhaps framed in, that's never going to happen, is it? Is often the thing. It's interesting. Do I think we're going to get to be full net zero? And the Church of England has said we'll allow 10% offset within that by 2030. Honestly, no. Do I think that the church is going to be such a huge fundamental quantum leap closer to being net zero by 2030 than it would have done had it set the target for 2040 or the other dates that were being discussed when General Synod voted for it? Yes, I think we've needed that target. I think the bit that's we're, as a church, when I say we, are going to have to kind of be a little bit more relaxed on is how much offsetting we're allowing in that, and possibly starting off with something quite considerably more than 10% in 2030, and then having a very regular and quite a steep decrease in that over time, and get down to that 10 or maybe even 5%, probably closer to 2040, I think. But we need to allow a little bit more time in there. And I don't think that should be seen as a failure. I think it would be very easy for people to go, oh, you've missed it. I think we still need to get to net zero, just allowing more offset into there.
It almost spurs on a sense of urgency as well, so it really promotes action. So I think it's a really important target.
And urgency is really important in this, and I have two children who are now 17 and 20. The 20-year-old is a major climate activist and very passionate on this. The 17-year-old is, but not quite so much so. And actually, for them, the urgency is very real, and they are our future. And I think we need to listen to them a lot more. And Greta Thunberg is absolutely out there. Sort of banging that drum on the urgency kind of thing, and kicking the can down the road. I think we've got to turn around and say we can't do that anymore. There's a lot we need to do, and if we delay for another 10 years, we're then going to be in a situation in 10 years' time where we still haven't got enough time left to do it. And, so we do need to be doing it now.
You mentioned your children there. Do you find, as somebody who doesn't have children, I can't possibly relate, but do you find them being so interested in environmental issues or climate activists, do you think that gives you motivation to do things as well?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I do get involved in a few areas with kind of education and youth, which is brilliant. So I help to advise Teach the Future, which is a student campaign group for increasing climate change education within the national curriculum. And within schools more generally. And it's incredibly powerful how strong that youth voice is. I have literally banged doors for politicians, and be that local or national, and policymakers going, look, I think I've got this idea, and maybe I think perhaps policy isn't quite going in the best direction here. They never reply to my emails. They, if I do get a letter back, then, it's a bit of a, yes, thank you very much, we've read that, and please refer to something that we spent some money on 5 years ago. Whatever else. The youth turn around and go, excuse me, we think this. It's really difficult for a politician to ignore somebody aged between, take whatever lower age group you want, but 5 or 6 up to kind of 18.
Yes.
It's very difficult for them to ignore. They want to be seen to be listening to them. So the power of their voice is incredible. And the passion that they can come across with, because perhaps they're not kind of worrying about how they're going to make a living from it, or it's going to, they can just say it like it is, they've got sort of less inhibitions and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's really important. And when they can turn around and say, look, man, this isn't your grandchildren's future. This is my future. And you can have some pretty difficult conversations in terms of, well, so what have you been doing about it? You know, why have you managed to let it get this bad? Because it's been on your watch.
Yes.
You know, that can get quite uncomfortable and can definitely spur you on and be motivating. So yeah.
Yes. I want to talk to you specifically about churches. Now, we have very similar jobs in that we both work with churches, trying to get churches to net zero, along with obviously other buildings too. And I don't know about you, but my friends always ask me the same questions, who are from outside my sphere and don't understand what I do for a living, even though I tell them about it all the time. They don't understand. And I get asked two main questions. And the first one is, do churches even have a carbon footprint?
Yeah, absolutely they have a carbon footprint, because almost all churches are using, well, virtually all churches are using electricity. Depending on where you are in the country, somewhere between 40% and 90% of the churches will be using some form of fossil fuel, gas, oil, LPG to heat. So they absolutely have a carbon footprint in terms of direct carbon footprint, scope 1 and 2 in sort of carbon footprinting language. In there, they're probably also buying goods, and whether that's the tea bags and the coffee, or whether that's actually a whole load of new seating or carpet or whatever, all of that's got a carbon footprint to it. So absolutely they have in that point of view. Also, people are travelling to that church to do things. So definitely there's a carbon impact on how they're getting there. And actually they're also so that's the direct carbon footprint. So yes, clearly, undoubtedly, they have a carbon footprint. But it's also interesting where they sit in the community and how they can then influence other people's views on things. So, interesting, you put, let's say, solar panels on the church, and then does everybody start going, hang about, if they can do it there, maybe I can do it too. And particularly in the sort of the historic listed buildings kind of area, where how many times have I been to buildings which aren't churches? And they've gone, oh yeah, but we're in a conservation area, so we can't do anything. I'm not even sure we can change our light bulbs. You're not listed. It's just because you're in a nice looking building and you're kind of in a nice area, and you probably are in a conservation area. Sometimes they're not even that. They feel this inertia. They're not allowed to do anything. So if you can demonstrate on the buildings that clearly are in conservation areas and are highly listed that, oh look, they've managed to do that, so now I can. That's got a really strong kind of, leverage out there as well. So I think they've both got a carbon footprint, and they've got the ability to influence other people's carbon footprints.
Interesting. And the other question that I get all the time, and you mentioned it there, how, most churches will have a gas or oil boiler. How do you heat a building that is centuries of years old, typically, and has no insulation, single glazed windows, huge space, and that's just massive roof, massive open space? How do you heat a building like that and provide comfort to visitors and parishioners?
I'm really glad you had the very last bit in there, which is how do you make it comfortable? Because actually, how do you heat that space is one question. How do you fill this massive, barn of a building with lots of warm air that bounces around, and you try and keep it in, and the problem is you don't. We've probably all been to churches where, remember, churches, pre-Victorian churches were not designed to have heating systems in them. They weren't designed to be heated in there. So, trying to warm that whole space up with warm air is probably going to fail. Yeah. And we've all been to churches like that. They've got a radiator in each corner, and they just, you're not warm sitting in the middle of the nave. So you can't really do it. So in a lot of the really, really important thing within providing comfort to people inside churches, we're not heating the building, we're heating the people. That's when we need to provide the comfort, it is going, well, how do you use this building? Where are those people? How long are they there for? Can I make them feel comfortable whilst they are where they are, doing what they're doing? And approach it from that point of view. Now, there are plenty of churches used very regularly, all day, every day, with lots of things going on inside them where we do want to be warming the whole air in the space, and that's when insulation and other bits and pieces come way more important. There are also thousands of churches which are used for a small number of hours a week, some if that, where actually we want to provide heat to people. And that can be done in a number of ways. It hasn't just got to be kind of shiny red infrared kind of lights shining on people. It can be heating coming up from underneath the pew seat, and actually you do have this warm air going over you, but actually that warm air then disappears. I'm only trying to heat that warm air at a fairly low level, which is the level that you're standing at, not 7 meters above your head. And all those kind of different techniques then come into play. So yeah, it's the core of it is moving, and this is a challenge actually for a lot of people when they first start thinking about church heating, is going, it's not a house. You don't need to heat this in the same way as you're building at home. And actually, I know you've got this fantastic heating system at home and it works really nicely for you in your little kind of 4-bedroom house, and that's all great. Doesn't mean to say it's going to work very well in your church.
Yes.
It's really good there. It's not so good over here. Yes. It's thinking in a very different way, and it's starting off by understanding the way in which it's used and providing comfort. Yeah. And
I guess hence the tagline, heat the people, not the space, as well. That's a really important one for churches, I think, to wrap their heads around.
It is, particularly for what is probably the majority of the usage of churches when we look in terms of number, where actually they're not used. I often turn around and sort of pick up a better answer. If you're starting to be used for 6 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, we're in a very different category. And there aren't that many churches that are used like that. There are some, absolutely, and we need to think about different ways of heating this. But the vast majority of churches aren't.
And something else you mentioned as well was the prospect of solar panels on churches. And I know in our diocese we have 14, and there's many other churches across the entire country that have solar panels, and they're all a variety of listings. But still, we have this assumption from our parishes that if we want solar panels, the DAC and the planning authorities are just going to say no. Is that the case?
No, it's almost definitely not the case. What they should be doing, and most DACs are actually pretty good at this now. The local authority planning depends on your area, and quite frankly depends down to your individual conservation architect. What they should be doing is judging the harm that those solar panels cause versus the benefit that they will deliver. And if the benefit is more than the harm, happy days. You should be able to have permission to put them on. Harm is going to be visual harm, primarily. It can be with the fixings and cable runs as well, but primarily it's going to be visual harm. So if it's not a very visible array, even though it might be slightly visible, then we've managed that down. But the often bit that the churches miss kind of giving some thought to is going, well, is it actually going to give me much benefit? And if you're a Sunday use church and you're only using it kind of 6 hours a week, I've got solar panels there producing electricity every daylight hour of the week. You're not going to get a lot of benefit from those solar panels. Why didn't you go along and speak to your church school just down the road? Because you put solar panels on that building and they will use the electricity from it because they are in daylight hours most days of the week. I know there's some holidays and those kind of things, but that's you're going to get much more benefit there. So it's really making sure there's a strong benefits case.
And I think you provide a perfect segue there into schools, because you also do a lot of work with schools.
We do a lot of work with schools.
And obviously, again, like really high energy use is obviously used, most of the year and throughout the day. So when you say you decarbonise the schools, so that's essentially just like, I'm assuming once the gas boiler dies, you've taken that out and you put in a heat pump. Is that air source or ground source?
Tends to be air source, not always, but tending to be air to air. So air conditioning units run in heating mode, tends to work quite nicely within schools. in there. So yeah, it's putting that system in, and it's taking oil boilers and gas boilers out and getting rid of oil tanks and gas meters. Hooray.
I want to move on to a couple of, I guess, less technical, more fun rounds of questioning. And I thought we could do a couple of rapid fire segments. And I think the first one, it might be hard to do this one rapid fire just because there's probably a bit of nuance to it, but energy myths. Now, I get a lot of people say a lot of different things to me in regards to what kind of heating systems work and why they don't work. And I know in the sort of age we're in this sort of post-truth era where you can pick up information from anywhere and you can just take it, I mean, as you please, really. So I thought I'd pick out maybe 5 of the most, maybe not the most pressing energy myths you've got, but maybe ones that I've come across in my work and my personal life as well. So the first energy myth that I wanted to ask you was, air source heat pumps do not work in houses that are not EPC rated A.
False. So EPC is a measure of theoretically how well performing that is. Lots of different things in there. Do look at the insulation of the property. So I'd say if it's E, F or G rated, it's definitely going to struggle more. You can still make it work, but it's going to be hard work. D or better rated, you shouldn't have too much of a problem in there. But yeah, EPC ratios can also be impacted by what your lighting is and whether you're on a gas-fired boiler,
sure.
and lots of other things in there. So it's not a brilliant measure. But
it's not always mutually exclusive.
No, absolutely not. But yeah,
okay,
definitely doesn't need to be A.
Okay. 2, if you just turn off heating in a building, there will be damp.
If you turn off heating, not necessarily, and particularly within churches, if you haven't got anything that's giving out moisture inside that building, there is no greater amount of moisture. It might, if you move from a warming time to a colder time, and in that warm time, then that moisture in the building, and there would always be some, it's not going to be 0% humidity, gets into the air, and then you cool that building down and that moisture hits cold surfaces, you will maybe get some condensation. Not necessarily damp, but yeah, you may get some built up. But often the problem is we're using heating to mask damp problems. So genuinely damp is getting into the building, we're putting heat into it, it's evaporating that damp at that level, but it's going somewhere else in the building and probably causing greater damage where you can't see it. So it doesn't get rid of it, solve the damp at the source. Okay. And 3, this is one that I've been having a debate with my girlfriend about, but leaving the sort of hot water or heating running constantly is more cost effective than just putting it on when you need it. So 90% of that is untrue. There is 10% where it has got some relevance. So I say almost all of the time, you're better to have the heating on when you want it and turn it off when you don't. The exceptions to that can be if you've got a pretty well-insulated building with underfloor heating and a heat pump. And particularly underfloor heating, you may be better to leave some elements of that running at a lower background level. So not constantly on, because actually the underfloor heating slab itself acts like a night storage heater. And if you cool that slab down too far, you're going to really struggle.
Yeah.
And then you're probably going to have to start putting in more and more excessive supplemental heating to get it to work, and it all starts to get out of balance. So there is some element of truth in little bits of it, but I would say 90% untrue.
Awesome. Okay. Number 4. So solar panels don't work very well in the UK because it's so cloudy.
They obviously work better when there's more daylight.
Yes.
So they work on daylight. They work even better with direct sunlight, but you don't need direct sunlight. So certainly, any part of particularly the southern realms of the UK, they work pretty well actually, and they're very good, and they've increased massively in efficiency in the last 15 years. You probably, as you start getting right into the northern reaches of Scotland, you might start to question, actually, is this the best thing to do? It could well be, and they're not wrong, they will still work. in there. But things you've really got to watch the solar panels are, let's not stick them under trees where it's really shady.
Sure.
But actually, and yes, they will work better in the south of France than they work in the UK, but it's still very valid to put them into the UK, and they still generate lots of electricity.
Now, final one. I believe, again, if research is correct, you have an electric car.
I do.
Now, I feel like this is quite an outdated energy myth, but in terms of the whole life cycle, so production and actual driving electric car, and then I guess disposal as well, is the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle bigger than a regular petrol diesel car?
Okay, it depends on so many factors.
Okay.
How fuel efficient your petrol diesel car is, and predominantly how you're charging your electric vehicle. So if you're choosing to charge your electric vehicle peak times between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. on a weekday evening, it's going to be way more carbon intensive than not. Also, then how you're dealing with your end of life issues. So, are you recycling? If you've got an old Land Rover and you're recycling all the parts on it because it's really easy, you only need one size spanner and everything comes off. That's going to be better than just going along and scrapping an electric car and just crushing it and sticking it into landfill or wherever. So you've got to think about lots of other aspects to it, but generally the bit that people miss is that an electric motor is massively, I think it's something like 5 or 8 times more efficient at creating forward motion in the wheels than an internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
So they are almost always way more efficient, and generally people that are driving electric cars are sort of concerned, and the industry is about how those materials are recycled. And it's interesting, people are telling us, the batteries aren't recyclable, or they've got lots of rare earth metals in them. They do. They are very recyclable, and everybody really wants to recycle them because those rare earth metals are rare, they are expensive.
Yes.
Of course people want to recover lithium. There are few countries, 1 or 2 in Europe, who are setting up massive battery recycling facilities. And they're not stupid. They're doing that because they're going, we'll take all your batteries. Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll recycle them. And no, we're not sitting on a massive pile of lithium. Isn't this useful? And I'll sell it back to you again. So it was just a bit like catalytic converters.
Sure.
They've got a real value to them.
Yes.
So of course you are going to recycle them, which means that, which the battery is way more recyclable than an internal combustion engine is, because it's all full of gunk and oil and nasty things. So yeah.
Awesome. Now, this next section, rapid fire. Are you familiar with the game of this or that? So where I say one thing. So, for example, tea or coffee?
Depends what time of day it is. Coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon.
Okay, there you go. So that's how it would go. So this is just to get inside the brain of Matt Fulford.
Okay.
So, solar or wind?
Solar on buildings, wind not on buildings.
New build or retrofit?
Retrofit every time.
LED lighting or smart heating controls?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I'm going to go for smart heating controls.
Okay.
Because it saves fossil fuels rather than electricity.
Yeah. Podcast or music?
See, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I'll go for music. I shouldn't say that doing a podcast, should I?
Cycling or EVs?
Oh, cycling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for you. Healthy.
Healthy.
Exercise,
you get to see nature whilst you're out there cycling on the road. Yeah.
Summer or winter?
See, I do like my heat, so I'm going to go for summer. I'm a summer man.
Composting or recycling?
Composting.
Green beans or baked beans?
Ooh, I'm not a baked bean fan. I'll go for green beans. Green beans, nicely fried, bit of butter.
Roof mount or ground mount solar?
Roof.
Interesting. Any particular reason for the roof?
I think we've got a lot of roof spaces that aren't really doing a great deal.
Yeah.
We've got ground which we could put to an awful lot of use. Don't get me wrong, I'm quite happy with either. But I think we've got a huge amount of roofs out there, which, massively underutilised. Let's just use them. Let's put them that electricity straight into the building. Let's not overstress the grid too much.
Yeah.
Maybe don't go too wild. Maybe, maybe you could put 100 panels on your roof, but you only need 20. So just put 20 up, use it.
And before we came here today, we did put up on our socials an opportunity for the audience to bring some questions in.
Sure.
And we did get two, and one of which is from our tech man, Harry. So first question, has there ever been a net zero project that you've worked on, maybe in the early days, where things maybe didn't go so well? And in terms of like the learnings from that, what kind of learnings did you get?
Yeah, look, I think you learn on every single project.
Of course.
There's always some that have gone well, which is lovely, and some that don't. And there's still points of learning. The church I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the first net zero carbon kind of churches in the modern era to kind of go from using oil. And that was back in 2010. We put a biomass boiler in.
Oh, wow.
We thought that was great at the time. I think probably 7-8 years later, kind of going, you know what, it does what it was meant to do, but it doesn't actually solve our heating issues within inside this church. It's still a cold church. We've still got the same radiators. This is really hard work to maintain and keep running. Interestingly, I've now got to electric under pew in there. So that kind of sticks out as one way you're going. That was definitely a lot of learning going on in there. I can think of another church, wasn't my project, but when I ended up advising on, that stuck in an air-to-water heat pump on the underfloor heating system. Badly specified, badly installed, incorrectly sized, and they should never have had an underfloor heating system in the first place because they need that church for a service every other Sunday.
Wow.
So that's always weighs heavy on my mind when I'm advising churches, particularly in rural environments. Going, oh yes, we're going to have everybody come to this church, and we want to put underfloor heating systems so that everybody will suddenly come and start using it. And you're thinking, reality check time. In there, interesting, that church just in the last month or two has now installed air-to-air heat pumps. And I'm yet to go out there, but I have received a note to say that they are very pleased with how they are working. So it's interesting to see how those have moved on in there. We've got a lot of infrared radiant heaters coming in lots of different formats now. A number of them really very successful. I've got 1 or 2 issues coming out on, again, a very small number of churches where they're starting to cause greater air movements. Okay. And it's understanding, why is that? What is it about that church that makes it work really, really well, and about that one where, we've got now an issue where it's created a draft. Right, okay. It's almost sort of sucking it up as a chimney effect. And learning those things and not being afraid, I think, sometimes to go, this bit hasn't worked that well, and this is the reason why, and therefore let's learn from that. Yeah. Every day's a school day.
Interesting. And final question from our audience, and this one's from Harry. So, again, you spoke to me before, you go to church, you attend a church. Would you say that your faith is a bit of a motivator in what you do for a living?
Yeah, I think deep down it is. I think there is a strong link to kind of stewardship of creation, piece, what we have, and whether people, and how overtly it's great, this is a church podcast, you can speak about it more overtly than perhaps you might otherwise do. Whether you want to put that into more spiritual terms and go, look, what we've got around us, we've got a beautiful earth, I believe that was God-given, and God-given, and we were here to look after that. But we have a precious, beautiful, but finite resource in terms of our planet. There, as the saying goes, there is no planet, no planet B. So we do need to look after that. Yeah. Yes, I think I have a stronger motivation in that because of my faith, thinking that actually, God is also kind of looking down on us going, I don't think you're doing the best job in the world at that. And, I do find sometimes it's quite useful when we are seeking forgiveness, perhaps to go out there and not just think about kind of, perhaps the more classic things that, wasn't very nice to that person this week or whatever else it was, but actually how much damage have I really caused to the environment this week? Now and there are some really nice bits of liturgy which really do then focus on that, and that I find sometimes that can be really quite motivating.
Really?
Of going, oh, actually, you know what, I could have done a lot better on that, and I kind of. Yeah, I quite like it when churches do that, and I think possibly we'll do a lot more of that. Of, you know, we kind of pray for sort of certain things, you know, government and you know, war zones and all these kind of things, you know, every week, and actually we ought to be focusing a little bit more on other kind of things as well as other areas, and I do find that motivating. Yeah, and yeah, I think deep down, when you stop and think about it, it does, it does drive you on that bit more. And sometimes it's a useful point to come back to, and can kind of help you kind of find that focus again. That, you know, I've had a difficult day today, you know. Well, why is it I'm doing all this again? Why is it I'm working this hard? And to come back to that point of faith. Particularly around creation, and go, no, this is why I'm doing it. Yeah, it really does help.
Well, thanks so much for sharing. I know it can be really personal for people that faith, so thanks so much for sharing. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up our podcast. And thanks so much for taking the time to come and be on my podcast. It was really informative, and I know our audience are gonna be really interested to hear what you got to say. So thanks so much, Matt, for coming on.
Fabulous.
And thank you, audience, for listening. And our next podcast will be released next month, and we hope to see you then.